The wind comes first, a low moan through the canyon that rattles the single glass pane in the cabin window. It is a harbinger, a messenger of the blinding white fury that follows. Snow begins to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, driving curtain that erases the horizon, swallowing the weak afternoon light whole. Inside, by the sputtering fire, Elias Thorne watches the world disappear and feels a cold dread that has nothing to do with the temperature. The sound he truly fears comes from the bedroom, a sharp, keening cry of pain from his wife, Sarah, followed by a desperate silence that is somehow worse. The labor started at dawn, and now, as dusk is smothered by the blizzard, it has gone terribly, horribly wrong. The local doctor, a man whose hands shake more from whiskey than from age, had already been summoned and dismissed, his diagnosis a grim, fatalistic shrug. "It's in God's hands now, son," he'd slurred before stumbling back toward the warmth of the town saloon. But Elias doesn't believe in a God who would demand this price for the gift of a child. He believes in the sweat on his own brow, the strength in his own hands, and the fierce, protective love he holds for the woman gasping for breath in the other room. He knows, with the terrible certainty of a man watching his world crumble, that he is losing her. He is losing them. There is a second heartbeat. The midwife had said weeks ago, a fragile flutter alongside its twin. Two lives, his and Sarah's future, are slipping away with every gust of wind that shrieks around the eaves. His father, Judge Silas Thorne, a man carved from granite and righteousness, would tell him to pray. He would speak of acceptance and divine will. But Elias sees his father's will, not God's, in their isolation. The judge had given him this parcel of land on the far edge of the territory as a punishment for marrying a woman of gentle heart, but no fortune. It is a place of beautiful, brutal solitude, too far for easy help. And now that solitude is a death sentence. But there is one other soul within riding distance, a person spoken of in whispers in town, a figure of fear and folklore. The Apache woman. They say she lives alone in a wickiup tucked into the Red Rock Canyons, that she knows the old ways of herb and healing. They also say she is a heathen, a savage, a danger. His father despises her people with a cold, biblical fury. To seek her help is not just an act of desperation. It is an act of profound defiance. It is a betrayal of his blood, his upbringing, everything the Thorne name stands for. Elias looks at the closed bedroom door, hears another broken sob, and knows that the Thorne name means nothing if Sarah is not here to share it. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. He makes the choice in the space of a single, agonized heartbeat. The world his father built, with its rigid laws and cold certainties, has failed him. He will seek help from the world his father condemns. He pulls on his heavy sheepskin coat, his movements jerky with a new, terrifying purpose. He would defy his father, defy the town, defy a decade of warnings to save his wife. He would go to the Apache woman. And as he stepped out into the blinding, roaring storm, he knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The ride was a battle against a living entity. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from the saddle, and the snow stung his face with 1,000 icy needles. His horse, a sturdy gelding named Dust, fought for every step, sinking to its huffs and drifts that appeared from nowhere. Elias navigated by instinct, by a faint memory of a thin curl of smoke he'd once seen rising from a cleft in the rocks miles from his own claim. He was chasing a ghost, a rumor, fueled by a hope so fierce it burned in his chest, warding off the invasive cold. The world of his father, the town of redemption, was built on order. Judge Silas Thorne was more than a magistrate. He was the architect of the region's morality. His justice was swift, unbending, and steeped in a certainty that left no room for nuance. For Judge Thorne, the world was composed of simple, stark truths. There was civilization and there was savagery, there was righteousness and there was sin, there were settlers and there were Indians. The lines were never to be crossed. Elias, his younger son, had always been a disappointment in that regard. He was quiet where his father was bombastic, thoughtful where his father was dogmatic. His greatest sin had been marrying Sarah, a schoolteacher's daughter with a dowry of books and little else. The judge saw the union as a dilution of the Thorne legacy, a sentimental folly. This remote plot of land, with its thin soil and unforgiving climate, was not a gift. It was an exile. Now, that exile was killing the one person who made it bearable. Elias gritted his teeth, urging dust forward. He thought of Nita. He didn't know her name then, only her description. The Apache Midwife. A woman who had refused to be herded onto the reservation miles south, choosing a solitary existence in the harsh lands her people had once roamed freely. The townsfolk saw her as a stubborn holdout, a remnant of a defeated people. They told stories to frighten their children, tales of dark magic and heathen ways. But Elias had heard other whispers, too, from grizzled trappers and Mexican freighters who spoke of her skill with injuries and fevers, of a knowledge that ran deeper than the town doctor's dusty medical books. He was staking his wife's life on those whispers. He found the dwelling by sheer luck. A brief lull in the wind revealed a faint orange glow against a rock face. It was less a cabin and more a part of the landscape itself, a sturdy wickiup of juniper branches and hide, banked with earth and stone, tucked so tightly into an overhang that it was almost invisible. A thin plume of smoke, smelling of cedar, escaped from a small hole in the roof. He dismounted, his legs stiff and numb, and approached the hide-covered entrance. For a moment, his father's voice echoed in his mind, a lifetime of warnings about the treachery and otherness of her people. He pushed the voice down. It was the voice of a world that had offered him no help. He called out, his own voice hoarse and raw. "Hello, is anyone there? I need help." The hide flap was pushed aside, and a woman emerged. She was not the crone of the town's scary stories. She was young, perhaps not much older than Sarah. Her face, framed by two thick black braids, was serene, but her dark eyes were cautious, appraising. She held a long knife, not as a threat, but with the casual ease of someone who was never without a tool. And then Elias saw it, the gentle swell of her belly beneath the deerskin dress. She was pregnant. The realization struck him with a fresh wave of despair. How could he ask this woman, in her own delicate condition, to ride into a blizzard and attend a grueling, dangerous birth? Her name was Nita, though he wouldn't learn it until later. She had learned the way of the healer from her grandmother, a wisdom passed through generations, a tapestry woven from herbs, chants, and an intimate understanding of the cycles of life and death. She had seen settlers before, usually from a distance, men with loud voices and hard eyes who saw the land as something to be broken, not understood. She had every reason to fear this man who stood before her, his face pale with desperation, snow clinging to his eyelashes. He was one of them, the people who had taken everything. He began to stammer, the words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and grief. "My wife, she's having babies. Twins. Something is wrong. The doctor, he can't do anything. Please. I know it's a lot to ask. I'll pay you. Anything." Nita listened, her expression unreadable. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the swirling white chaos he had just ridden through. She knew that storm. She knew the danger. Her hand rested instinctively on her own rounded stomach, a silent communion with the life she carried. Her first instinct was refusal. It was not her place. It was not her trouble. These people, his people, had brought nothing but pain to her own. But then she looked into his eyes. She was a midwife. She had been taught that life, in its first, desperate moments, belonged to no tribe. It was simply life, a sacred flame struggling to catch. In his frantic plea, she did not hear a settler demanding service. She heard a husband's terror, a father's agony. It was a language she understood intimately. She saw past the gulf of race and history and saw a human being begging for help. She gave a single, sharp nod. She disappeared back inside for a moment, emerging with a leather satchel and a heavy buffalo hide robe. She spoke for the first time, her voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the screaming wind. "I will need your horse. Mine is not strong enough for this storm." Elias didn't hesitate. He helped her mount Dust, his hands clumsy with cold and relief. As she settled herself in the saddle, wrapping the heavy robe around her, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in hours: hope. It was a fragile, terrifying thing. He had placed the lives of his wife and children into the hands of a stranger, an outcast, a pregnant Apache woman in the middle of a blizzard. It was an act of madness. It was an act of faith. He took hold of the bridle and began the long, treacherous walk back, leading the horse and its precious rider into the heart of the storm. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing trek through a landscape rendered alien and hostile by the blizzard. Elias walked ahead, one hand on the bridle, the other held up to shield his face from the relentless, stinging snow. Behind him, Nita sat silently on the horse, a still, wrapped figure against the white chaos. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the roar of the wind, the labored breathing of the horse, and the immense, unspoken weight of their mission. Every step was a gamble, every snow-filled gully a potential disaster. Elias felt the fragile thread of his hope stretching thin, threatening to snap. He was leading this woman, this expectant mother, into the same danger he was trying to rescue his family from. The thought was a bitter pill. When they finally stumbled into the small yard of his homestead, the cabin was a beacon of faint, welcoming light. He pushed the door open and a wave of warm, tense air washed over them. Sarah's younger sister, Mary, a girl of 17, rushed forward, her face streaked with tears. "Elias, she's weaker," Mary whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she saw Nita. The girl took an involuntary step back, her ingrained prejudice warring with her desperation. Elias ignored her reaction. "Get some water boiling, and bring every clean cloth we have," he commanded, his voice firm. He helped Nita dismount, his touch gentle on her arm. She swayed for a moment, the long, cold ride having taken its toll, but quickly steadied herself. She pulled the heavy, snow-crusted robe from her shoulders, revealing the simple deerskin dress and the proud swell of her belly. She handed him her leather satchel of herbs and tools, her eyes already scanning the small cabin, assessing, preparing. The moment she stepped into the bedroom, the atmosphere shifted. Where there had been panic and despair, Nita brought an aura of profound, unshakable calm. Sarah lay on the bed, her face pale and slick with sweat, her breathing shallow. Her eyes were closed, her body frighteningly still between the waves of pain. Nita didn't hesitate. She went to the bedside and placed a hand on Sarah's forehead, then gently on her stomach. Her touch was not clinical like the doctor's. It was knowing, compassionate. She began to speak in a low, murmuring tone, some of the words in her own tongue, others in simple, clear English. "Breathe with the storm," she whispered to Sarah, her voice a soothing anchor in the room. "Do not fight it. Let it pass through you." Elias stood in the doorway, feeling useless and overwhelmingly large in the small space. He watched as Nita worked. She moved with an economy and grace that was mesmerizing. She opened her satchel, and the scent of dried herbs, sage, juniper, and others he didn't recognize, filled the air, cutting through the smell of sickness. She crushed some leaves into a cup of hot water Mary brought, holding it to Sarah's lips. She repositioned Sarah on the bed, her hands firm and sure, coaxing the exhausted woman into a position that would work with her body, not against it. Hours bled into one another. The blizzard raged outside, its fury a constant, howling counterpoint to the quiet, intense drama unfolding within the cabin. Elias fed logs into the fire, kept the water hot, and watched. He watched as this Apache woman, a stranger his own father would have condemned on sight, fought for his family with a tenacity and skill that humbled him. He saw the lines of fatigue deepen around her own eyes, saw the way she would pause and press a hand to her own back, a fleeting acknowledgement of her own body's burden. Yet her focus on Sarah never wavered. At one point, as Nita was preparing a warm compress, her eyes met his across the room. There was no judgment in her gaze, no accusation. There was only a shared understanding of the precipice on which they all stood. In that moment, the barriers between them, race, culture, a history of violence and mistrust, seemed to dissolve into insignificance. He was a terrified husband, and she was the only one who could help. It was that simple and that profound. The first crisis came near midnight. Sarah let out a sharp cry, her body arching in a contraction that was different, more violent. Nita's face grew serious. "The first child," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It does not want to come the right way. It is breach." A cold dread washed over Elias. He knew what that meant. He had heard the stories. It was often a death sentence for both mother and child. Mary gasped and began to pray aloud, her words a frantic, desperate litany. Nita's calm sharpened into a diamond-hard focus. "Be quiet, girl," she said to Mary, not unkindly. "Your fear does not help. Elias, come here. I need you." He was by her side in an instant. "What do you need?" "Hold her hands. Speak to her. Keep her here," Nita instructed. "Do not let her spirit wander." He took Sarah's limp hands in his own, leaning close to her ear. He spoke of the house he would build for them, the field he would clear, the way the light looked in her hair in the morning. He spoke of their children, giving them names, giving them a future to fight for. And as he spoke, Nita worked. With hands that were impossibly gentle and unbelievably strong, she began to move, to press, to guide. It was a language of touch, a deep, ancient knowledge flowing through her fingertips. It was nothing like the brutal, metallic interventions he'd heard the doctor describe. It was a partnership with the natural forces of birth, not a war against them. The hours that followed were a blur of sweat, prayer, and pain. Nita's quiet chants mingled with Sarah's ragged breaths and Elias's whispered words of encouragement. The small cabin became a sacred space, a bubble of intense life sealed off from the dying world outside. The birth of the first twin was a hard-fought victory, a tiny, gasping girl with a thatch of dark hair, her cry a thin, reedy trumpet of survival. Mary wept with relief, but Nita barely paused. She cleaned the child, wrapped her in a clean cloth, and handed her to Elias before turning her attention back to Sarah. "There is another," she said, her voice strained with fatigue. "We are not done." The second twin, a boy, came more easily, as if his sister had cleared the path for him. His cry was lusty and strong, filling the small room with a sound of such profound vitality that it seemed to push back the storm itself. Elias stood holding his daughter, his son now cradled in Mary's arms, and looked at his wife. Sarah was utterly spent, pale as the snow outside, but she was breathing evenly, her eyes fluttering open. She was alive. They were all alive. A wave of gratitude, so powerful it brought him to his knees, washed over Elias. He looked at Nita, who was now quietly cleaning her tools, her movements slow and deliberate. The front of her dress was stained, her face etched with exhaustion, but her dignity was a palpable force. She had not just delivered his children. She had performed a miracle. She had walked into the heart of their despair and led them back into the light. He found his voice, though it was thick with emotion. "I don't know how. I can never repay you." Nita looked from the sleeping babies to the recovering mother, and then to him. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "The payment is in the breathing," she said softly. A fragile peace settled over the cabin. The storm had begun to recede, its howls softening to a mournful whisper. The twins, swaddled tightly, slept in a wooden crate near the fire. Sarah, propped up on pillows, drifted in a shallow, healing sleep. The immediate crisis had passed, and in its wake was a quiet sense of wonder. Elias felt as if he had been remade. The man who had ridden out into the blizzard was not the same one who now sat by the hearth, watching over his family. The world was sharper, its colors more vivid. He had stared into the abyss and been pulled back by the steady, capable hands of a woman his entire society had taught him to despise. He made a pallet for Nita by the fire, insisting she rest. "You can't travel back in this," he said. "The drifts will be too deep. Please, stay, at least until the path is clear. You're a guest in my home." Nita was reluctant. Her own home, her solitude, was her sanctuary. To stay here, in the heart of the settler's world, felt dangerous. Every instinct told her to return to the safety of her canyon. But she was exhausted, a deep bone weariness that came not just from the harrowing birth, but from the constant strain of her own pregnancy. The journey back will be perilous. She looked at the sleeping infants, at the profound vulnerability of the new family, and she relented with a simple nod. She owed it to the new lives she had helped bring into the world to ensure their mother was strong enough to care for them. She accepted the pallet and a blanket, but sleep did not come easily. She lay listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin, the soft sighs of the babies, the crackle of the fire, the steady breathing of the man who sat watch in a rocking chair, a rifle resting across his knees. She knew he wasn't guarding against wolves. He was guarding against his own kind. In the morning, the world was a pristine, blinding expanse of white under a painfully blue sky. The beauty of it was sharp, almost violent. Elias went out to check on the livestock, his boots crunching in the deep snow. It was then that he saw the tracks. A single horse, ridden hard from the direction of town, had come and gone since the storm broke. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He recognized the distinctive mark of the shod horse belonging to Jed Olson, one of his father's ranch hands, a man whose loyalty to the judge was absolute. Olson must have ridden out to check on them after the storm, seen the unfamiliar horse, Nita's horse, left in the lean-to, and ridden back to report. The news would travel fast. The town doctor, his professional pride stung and his incompetence exposed, would surely add his own venom to the story. He would not speak of a skilled midwife saving a mother and her twins. He would speak of heathen rituals and savage witchcraft performed on a good Christian woman. He would twist Nita's act of mercy into something dark and sinister. Elias's jaw tightened. He had known there would be a reckoning. He just hadn't expected it to come so soon. Inside the cabin, a tentative connection was forming between the two women. Nita, rested now, was showing Mary how to properly swaddle the infants and how to brew a tea from raspberry leaf to help Sarah's body heal. Her movements were gentle, her instructions simple and clear. Sarah, awake and lucid, watched her with eyes full of a deep, wondering gratitude. "My father, Judge Thorne. He will hear of this," Sarah said, her voice weak but steady. She looked at Nita with concern. "He won't understand. He can be a hard man." Nita simply nodded, her face betraying no fear. "Hard men are like winter winds," she replied, her voice soft. "They howl and bite, but they cannot stop the spring." But Elias knew his father was more than a winter wind. He was a glacier, a slow-moving, unstoppable force that crushed everything in its path. The peace of the morning felt fragile, a thin pane of glass about to be shattered. He owed Nita more than just a place to rest and a meal. He owed her his protection. The debt he felt was no longer just about gratitude. It was about honor. She had honored his home and his family with her gift, and he would be damned if he let his father's blind prejudice be her reward. The feeling of protectiveness was a new and powerful thing. It was different from the love he felt for Sarah. This was a fierce, almost primal instinct to shield this quiet, dignified woman from the ugliness of his world. He had invited her into his home, and in doing so, had placed her directly in the path of his father's wrath. The responsibility for her safety was now his. Later that day, the threat materialized. It arrived not with a roar, but with the measured, official clop of horses ridden at a walk. Elias saw them from the window, two riders cresting the snowy hill. One was the town sheriff, a man named Miller, his silver star glinting in the bright sun. The other was Judge Silas Thorne. The judge sat atop his tall black horse like a king surveying his domain. Even from a distance, Elias could feel the cold fury radiating from him. He was not here to celebrate the birth of his grandchildren. He was here to restore order, to punish a transgression, to put his errant son and the savage who had aided him back in their proper places. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He turned from a window and looked at Nita, who was calmly rocking one of the crying twins. She had heard the horses too. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw no fear, only a deep, weary resignation, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. "Stay inside with Sarah," he said to her and Mary, his voice low and tight. He took his rifle from its pegs by the door, not as a threat, but as a statement. He would not be cowed, not in his own home. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold air a shock against his skin, and closed the door firmly behind him. He would face the glacier alone. The two riders stopped a dozen yards from the porch. Sheriff Miller, a decent man caught in the gravitational pull of a powerful one, looked uncomfortable. He kept his gaze fixed on the middle distance, avoiding Elias's eyes. Judge Thorne, however, stared directly at his son, his face a mask of cold disappointment and righteous anger. His voice, when he spoke, was like the crack of ice. "Elias, you have brought a contamination into this house." It was not a question. It was a verdict already delivered. "I brought a healer into this house," Elias retorted, his own voice tight with a controlled fury he hadn't known he possessed. "She saved your grandchildren. She saved my wife. She is a heathen, a squaw." The judge spat the word, making it sound like a profanity. "Her presence here is an abomination. Dr. Finch tells me he found strange charms, heard pagan chanting. He believes your wife was subjected to witchcraft." Elias let out a short, bitter laugh. Dr. Finch was drunk and useless. This woman did what he could not. She used knowledge, not witchcraft. She used skill, not charms. "The law is the law," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level. "And my law in this county says we do not abide vagrants and trespassers, especially not her kind. She has no right to be on this land, practicing her superstitions. Sheriff, you'll go inside and arrest her." Sheriff Miller shifted in his saddle, his discomfort now palpable. He looked from implacable judge to the defiant son. "Now, judge, on what charge exactly?" "Vagrancy, practicing medicine without a license, endangering the welfare of a citizen." "Take your pick, man. Just do your duty," the judge snapped. This was the moment, the turning point. Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He could acquiesce. He could step aside, let them take Nita, and try to repair the breach with his father. He could salvage his inheritance, his place in the world the judge had built. All he had to do was betray the woman who had saved his family. All he had to do was sacrifice his own soul. He looked back at the closed cabin door. Behind it were his wife, his newborn children, and the quiet, pregnant woman who had asked for nothing and given everything. The choice was not a choice at all. He stepped down from the porch, planting his feet firmly in the snow, the rifle held loosely at his side. He stood directly between the riders and his front door. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the vast, snowy silence. The judge's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed into slits of pure rage. "What did you say to me?" "I said no," Elias repeated, his voice gaining strength. "Nita is a guest in my home. She is under my protection. You will not touch her." For the first time in his life, Elias was not his father's son. He was his own man. The air crackled with the tension of his defiance. He saw a flicker of something in the sheriff's eyes, not quite support, but a grudging respect. The glacier had just hit a wall of unmovable rock. The confrontation on the snowy patch of ground in front of the cabin felt like the center of the universe. Time seemed to slow, the silence broken only by the huffing breath of the horses and the distant caw of a raven. Judge Thorne's face, already a thundercloud, darkened to a shade of purple fury. He was a man who had never been told no by his own son, a man whose authority had never been so brazenly challenged. "Protection," the judge scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You would offer your protection to a savage over your own blood? Over your own father?" "She is not a savage," Elias said, his voice level and cold. "She is a woman of honor and skill." And right now, her honor is worth more than a name you use to bully and control everyone around you. You didn't come here to see your grandchildren. You didn't come here to see if my wife was well. You came here to punish me for not letting her die according to your rules. Every word was a stone pulled from the foundation of their relationship. Every syllable was a severing. You are a fool, Elias. An idealistic, sentimental fool. You throw away your name, your inheritance, everything for her. The judge gestured dismissively toward the cabin. My inheritance is in that house, Elias shot back, his gaze unwavering. It's my wife breathing. It's my son and my daughter sleeping by the fire. That is the only legacy I care about, and she's the reason I still have it. The judge turned his wrath on the sheriff. Miller, are you going to let this boy defy the law? Are you going to let him harbor this fugitive? Do your duty. Sheriff Miller was a man caught between two immovable forces. He was a creature of the law, and the judge was the law in this county. But he was also a man with a conscience, and it was being pricked raw. He had seen Sarah Thorne in town just a week ago, her belly swollen with child. He knew Dr. Finch was more drunk than sober most days, and he could see the fierce, righteous conviction in Elias's eyes. This was not the act of a madman. It was the stand of a husband and father. Before Miller could respond, the cabin door opened. Nita stepped out onto the porch. She had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and she stood tall, her hand resting on her own pregnant belly. Her face was calm, a mask of stoic dignity that made the judge's sputtering rage look coarse and childish. She looked not at the judge, but at Elias. I will go with them, she said, her voice clear and steady. This is not your fight. You have a family to think of. Her willingness to sacrifice herself to save him from his father's wrath galvanized Elias. It was a testament to her character, a quiet courage that shamed the judge's blustering power. He turned and took a step toward her, placing a hand gently on her arm to stop her. It was an unconscious gesture, but in the charged atmosphere, it was a profound public declaration. He was physically and symbolically aligning himself with her against his father. This is my fight, he said, his voice soft enough for only her to hear, before turning back to the riders. This is my home, and she is staying. Suddenly, another voice, weak but clear, cut through the tension from the open doorway. Father, it was Sarah. She was standing there, pale and trembling, leaning heavily on the doorframe, with Mary holding her steady. Her eyes were fixed on the judge. Father, that woman, Nita, she saved me, Sarah said, her words coming in ragged gasps. The babies, they wouldn't be alive. I wouldn't be alive. She is a miracle. What you're doing is a sin. The judge stared at his daughter-in-law, as if she were a ghost. Her testimony, delivered from what was so nearly her deathbed, was a powerful blow. It stripped away his pretense of protecting her welfare, laying bare the ugly prejudice beneath. Sheriff Miller visibly flinched, his gaze dropping to his saddle horn. He could not arrest a woman hailed as a hero by the very person she had allegedly endangered. The charge was collapsing under the weight of the truth. Elias saw his advantage. He pressed it, his voice ringing with a moral clarity that his father could not match. You see, Sheriff? There is no crime here. The only crime is the blind hatred my father wants to call justice. This land, this home is mine. It was a poor gift, but it's mine. And my family is under my protection. That includes this woman, who I owe a debt I can never repay. Now, I am telling you both, as the man of this house, get off my property. The finality in his tone was absolute. He had drawn a line in the snow, not just around his land, but around his life. On one side was everything he now held sacred, his wife, his children, his honor, and the quiet woman standing beside him. On the other side was his father. Judge Silas Thorne was defeated. He was a man whose power was built on fear and public deference, and in front of the sheriff, he had been stripped of both. His own son had defied him, his daughter-in-law had condemned him, and the law itself, in the form of a wavering sheriff, was failing him. He was rendered impotent. He stared at Elias for a long, silent moment, his face a maelstrom of shock, fury, and something that looked almost like pain. He had lost. He had lost his son. "You are no longer a thorn," he finally whispered, the words carrying a terrible weight. "You are dead to me." He wrenched the reins of his horse, turning the animal so sharply it snorted in protest. Without another word, without a single glance at the cabin that held his newborn grandchildren, he spurred his horse and galloped away, his back rigid with fury and defeat. Sheriff Miller lingered for a moment. He tipped his hat, a gesture of profound, conflicted respect toward the porch. "Mr. Thorne," he said, addressing Elias with a new formality. "Ma'am." He gave a nod that included both Sarah and Nita. Then he too turned his horse and rode away, leaving behind a stillness that was deeper and more complete than the silence of the snow. The air, which moments before had been electric with conflict, was now utterly still. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the wind through the pines and the thumping of Elias's own heart. He stood watching until the figures of his father and the sheriff were nothing more than small specks against the vast white canvas of the world. Gone. The threat was gone. He slowly lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly immense in his hands. He felt a tremor run through him, the delayed shock of the confrontation. He had won. He had stood his ground and protected his own, but he had also shattered his past irrevocably. The bridge back to his old life, to his father, was burned to ashes. He turned and looked at the porch. Sarah had been helped back to a chair just inside the door, her face pale but shining with pride. And Nita stood where she had been, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes watching him. The gulf between them felt both vast and non-existent. They were from different worlds, a man and a woman who should have been enemies, bound by a history of sorrow and bloodshed. Yet in this small, isolated place they had forged something else entirely. Une alliance, a bond of mutual respect born in a crucible of fear and fire and ice. He walked up the steps and stopped in front of her. The words of thanks he wanted to say felt small and inadequate, like trying to catch the ocean in a cup. What could he say to the woman who had not only saved his family, but had also, in a way, saved him from a life of quiet subservience? "Thank you," he said at last. The two words were all he could manage, but he poured into them all the gratitude, all the respect, all the awe he felt. Nita held his gaze. For the first time, the guarded stillness in her eyes softened. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, a brief, beautiful sunrise on her stoic face. She gave a single, slight nod, an acknowledgement that needed no words. The debt was paid, not with coin, but with courage. He had stood for her, just as she had fought for his wife. They were even. Inside the cabin, one of the twins began to cry, a thin, demanding wail that was the most beautiful sound Elias had ever heard. It was the sound of the future, a future he had just fought for. He held the door open for Nita, and as she stepped past him into the warmth of the cabin, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. His father had declared him dead to the Thorn name, but Elias had never felt more alive. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself in the small cabin. It was a rhythm of quiet healing and shared work. The world outside, with its harsh judgments and broken ties, felt distant, its power muted by the solid wooden walls of the home. Inside, there was only the immediate, demanding reality of new life. Nita stayed. There was no formal discussion. It was simply understood. The trails remained treacherous with melting snow, and Sarah was still regaining her strength. But more than that, her presence had become a part of the fabric of the household. She was no longer just a guest or a healer. She was a quiet, steadying anchor. She showed Sarah the best way to hold the twins, to nurse them both at once, a trick of balance and pillows that seemed like magic. She taught Mary how to grind juniper berries to make a cleansing tea. Her knowledge, once feared as heathen, was now seen for what it was, a deep and practical wisdom. Elias watched the gentle, unspoken partnership form between his wife and Nita. He would come in from chopping wood or tending the animals and see them sitting together by the fire, Sarah nursing one baby while Nita rocked the other, humming a low, ancient lullaby. The song, with its unfamiliar melody and soft, guttural sounds, was a thread of her world woven into the tapestry of his. He found it deeply comforting. It was the sound of a larger, more complex world entering his small one, enriching it. One evening, as Sarah slept and the babies were settled, Elias found Nita standing by the window, looking out at the vast, star-dusted sky. Her hands were folded over her own child, a gesture he had seen her make often. "You should have a name for your son," Nita said quietly, without turning around. "A strong name." "I was thinking of Nathaniel for the boy," Elias replied, coming to stand beside her. "It means gift of God," he paused. "And for our daughter, Sarah wants to call her Hope." Nita turned her head slightly, a small smile playing on her lips. "Hope, that is a good name. It is a strong shield." She looked back out at the night. "My people have a story about the North Star. It does not move. When all other things are lost or changing, it stays. It guides you home." He understood she was giving him a gift, another piece of her world. "Thank you for telling me that. You are a good man, Elias Thorne," she said, her directness surprising him. "You stood against your own father for one of my people. That is not a small thing." "He is no longer my father," Elias said, the words tasting like ash. "And you are not just one of your people, you are Nita, the woman who saved my family." A quiet understanding passed between them, a recognition of the profound, life-altering journey they had navigated together. The labels of settler and Apache were still there like shadows, but they no longer defined the space between them. That space was now filled with a shared history, with mutual respect, with the lives of two sleeping children. A few days later, the path to her canyon was finally clear. Nita announced her departure quietly, matter-of-factly. She packed her small satchel, her movements as deliberate as they had been on the night she arrived. Sarah, now strong enough to walk around the cabin, cried. She pressed a beautifully embroidered shawl into Nita's hands. "It isn't enough," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Nothing could ever be enough." Nita accepted the gift with a gracious nod. "You have given me a place of safety," she replied. "That is a great gift." Elias insisted on riding with her, to ensure her journey was safe. He saddled his horse and helped her mount. As they set off, he looked back at his cabin. Sarah stood in the doorway, holding Hope, her face a mixture of sadness and gratitude. The image was seared into his mind. His wife, his child, his home, all saved by the woman riding silently beside him. They rode for hours, the silence comfortable, the landscape beautiful in its harsh, post-storm clarity. When they reached the entrance to her hidden canyon, Elias dismounted. "I will come and check on you," he said. "It wasn't a question. When your time is near, I will bring Sarah. We will help you." Nita looked down at him from the horse, and for a long moment, she simply studied his face. He saw in her eyes a flicker of surprise, then a deep, soul-settling acceptance. He was offering to repay his debt not with coin or goods, but in kind. He was offering her the one thing her people had been so brutally denied, a neighbor. She nodded slowly. "I will not turn away, friends," she said. He watched her guide the horse into the narrow canyon until she disappeared from view. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the rocks and sky around him. He had lost a father, his inheritance, and his place in the town of redemption. He was an outcast now, just as she was. But as he turned his horse for home, riding back toward the sound of his children crying and the smell of his own chimney smoke, he did not feel loss. He felt as if he had finally, truly, found his place in the world. He was no longer Judge Thorne's son. He was Hope's father. He was Nita's friend, and that, he knew, was an inheritance of far greater worth. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.